Hey, it's Nicholas here with a 20-minute presentation on N-theory, a falsifiable, coherent theory of consciousness and local reality. Now, before I get started, we should be clear, we'll be looking at what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness or P consciousness, or what everyday folk might call conscious experience. For example, the very sights and sounds you'll be witnessing during this presentation. Now, one of the main reasons that I developed N-theory was so that we could have a concrete, reasoned alternative to the current mainstream science approach to consciousness. Now, that mainstream approach says that conscious experience is some sort of emergent property of brain activity, somewhat analogous to temperature or the rigidity of a solid body. Now, conscious experience could, in principle, occur in nature by some mechanism like this, an emergent mechanism. But if it is conventionally emergent, it turns out, as I've shown in this true consciousness science paper, that it's actually impossible to do experiments on it. So that puts mainstream science in this weird position, which it hasn't quite recognized yet. If its explanatory regime for consciousness is correct, it's actually impossible for there to be a recognizable experimental science of consciousness inside that regime. So the key issue for experimental consciousness science is whether reality is dynamically orthodox or unorthodox. So essentially, dynamical orthodoxy means that qualia valued contents of conscious experience, things like the greenness here, can't influence the matter activity of the brain. And dynamical orthodoxy of matter denies experiments about experience because under it, we can't talk about or report experience. Why is that? Well, the only way information can flow is from brain to experience, but not from experience to brain the other way. So one of the major contrasts between N-theory and the currently mainstream approach to conscious experience lies in N-theory's proposal that experience isn't an emergent property. In fact, N-theory suggests that what we see, hear, and sense is actually made directly out of matter, albeit rather amusingly, a kind of dark matter. Now, dark matter is so called because it doesn't couple with photons, but coupling with photons occurs over here in the matter realm. So dark in the physics sense has nothing to do with experiential seeing. Now to the mainstream and perhaps to you, this dark matter hypothesis may seem bizarre, but this presentation is here precisely to explain why on scientific grounds, each and every feature of N-theory takes the form that it does. So I'll be coming back later to do that for things like extra dimensions. And I'll end this presentation by sketching experimental tests of all of these features. And this is an experimental program that the mainstream completely lacks while still claiming scientific status. So as an illustration of N-theory justification, if any science of consciousness is to exist, there must be an experience to brain linkage as well as a brain to experience linkage. Now, one way to do that is to build a matter bridge from matter brain to matter experience, and another from matter experience to matter brain. Technical problems occur if experience is made up of conventional matter, so instead we employ a currently unexplained feature of the physical universe, namely dark matter. The point of this matter-matter-matter construction is that it implements dynamical unorthodoxy, which allows for experiments about experience and coheres with our subjective intuition that the contents of experience are causally significant. Now, to be clear, I'm not claiming N-theory is the one true scientific explanation of consciousness. Rather, it's part of a call for a real science of consciousness, beginning with a theoretical study of the conditions for such a science, followed by an experimental assessment of whether those conditions actually apply in the reality we live in. And only then, if those conditions do apply, can we have a truly scientific assessment of a variety of candidates, including, but not limited to, N-theory. So as I've said, the main focus of this presentation will be to explain where the structural features of N-theory come from. Now, to understand why a human artifact, such as N-theory, takes the form that it does, it's sometimes helpful to understand the purpose it serves or is meant to serve. So a primary purpose of N-theory is to stand as a viable, coherent, experimentally testable hypothesis, which highlights and fixes the astounding and egregious flaws in the mainstream approach to consciousness science. So we'll discuss these issues and their remedies in a bit more detail in a few moments. But N-theory also has a distinct secondary purpose in relation to mainstream science, concerning the overall structure of scientific theory, rather than the explanation of consciousness within that structure. So in the current mold, fundamental natural properties, such as particle kinds and dimensionality, can allegedly only be studied in high energy physics, in particle colliders, and by space telescopes. But N-theory is a high-level biophysical theory, making grounded, testable assertions in realms ranging from dark matter to dimensionality, and even to the computational nature of intelligence. So this secondary purpose, breaking the mold of conventional science, also contributes to why N-theory has its distinctive form and feel. Now, as a brief aside, a different kind of why question I sometimes get asked is, why is N-theory called N-theory? Where does the N come from? And the answer to this question is another question. What comes after M? Now, M-theory is one of physics' leading contenders for an ultimate theory. And I've called N-theory N-theory to provocatively suggest that M-theory and other leading candidates in current physics can't be the end for our physical understanding of the universe. Notably, they don't, and in fact can't, in their current form, address conscious experience and its physical requirements, such as its constitution, its dynamical character, and its dimensional embedding. And conscious experience is arguably the one thing that humankind does know to exist. Any physics that fails to explain this one thing has, I'd say, at best, a tenuous claim on being our go-to explanatory mode. Returning to the purposeful whys rather than the naming whys, another role that N-theory plays is in philosophical discourse. Now, I know most scientists completely deny the value of philosophy, so I'll be brief here. N-theory shows that we can have a basic viable theory of consciousness that could be called materialist, thus pointing to the futility of a popular attack on mainstream science on the basis that it's materialist and materialism can't explain consciousness. So this pointing out is actually meant to redirect energy into the issues that actually are crucial and tractable. For example, the orthodox or unorthodox dynamical character of reality, rather than the nature of the substance or medium that's doing the dynamics. Now, this redirection isn't meant to assert the primacy of materialism, because, for example, we can also easily state an idealist version of N-theory too. Now, plausibly, many scientists see science and spirituality as things that should mainly be kept separate. I'm not in this camp, actually, because if spirit is real, as it is to me, one of the main questions is whether it can couple with matter and in what ways. And that coupling question is quintessentially scientific, notably because it's amenable to experimental test via matter-based setups. So briefly again, N-theory has a purpose at the science-spirituality frontier, precisely because it can be embedded in three different metaphysical interpretations: as a form of extended materialism, as a dual aspect matter and mind approach, and finally, in an idealist consciousness all there is view. So by emphasizing how people can conceptualize or will conceptualize and interpret N-theory may depend on their own inner psychological and or psychospiritual configuration, N-theory suggests that catalyzing transformation of this inner configuration may sometimes be more constructive than arguing about which interpretation is correct, or what people popularly say, true. Now, this then points to the value of demonstrating, proving the impossibility of conventional, dynamically orthodox consciousness science. Because once the crutch of that kind of materialism is removed, reason demands that one steps onto the lowest rung of a transformational ladder, namely end theory as a form of extended materialism. Now, this presentation isn't going to discuss philosophical, spiritual, or even the wider scientific context any further, even though end theory has important things to say and do in those contexts. Instead, I'll focus on explaining the reasoning, again, behind specific features of end theory in the context of developing a coherent science of consciousness, a new mainstream approach, if you like. Now, I'll also be acknowledging, as I've already mentioned, that end theory isn't the only viable candidate in such a science, and I'll use strong emergence with downward causation as a placeholder for these other possibilities. So downward causation here means that qualia-valued states like that greenness that we saw can influence brain activity, unlike the current mainstream's conventional emergence, where the information only goes from the brain to the greenness. Finally, I'll be sketching an experimental tree which can arbitrate between various distinct and significant theory classes. And unlike what passes for an alleged science right now, finally initiate a real science of consciousness. So, as I've already indicated or hinted, the construction of end theory isn't a standalone item. It connects with a number of other landmark initiatives, papers, and books, all of which you can find out more about at the cfdis.org website. That's the Center for Dialogue in Science. Specifically, you can refer back to this table, if you wish, at a later date, to connect some of the specific themes which I touch on in this presentation to the larger work. For example, to find out more about dynamical orthodoxy and unorthodoxy and its significance for consciousness science, you can refer to this True Consciousness Science paper and associated videos, the book From Gödel to Trump, or the least technical presentation of the three, the book The Science We Need. And again, you can find links to all of these resources at cfdis.org. Okay, so on to the main remaining event, the scientific explanation of why end theory has the structural features that it does, or to put it differently, how to defend end theory against ungrounded and unjustified accusations that end theory is wild-eyed, woo-woo nonsense. So let's start with the dark matter aspect. So as I've already explained, for there to be a science of conscious experience itself must couple with or influence brain activity. The current mainstream doesn't have this coupling, so it can't actually be a science. And so again, the reason for putting dark matter here is that the simplest way to make experience couple with the matter brain is to propose that experience itself is made of matter. Now, for technical reasons, such as the interaction of experience with conventional matter out in the external environment of a human experiencer, all these technical reasons point to using dark matter rather than conventional matter as the building block for experience itself. So, as I repeatedly point out, brain experience coupling, unorthodox dynamics, can also be achieved under strong emergence with downward causation. But there are a whole host of other spatial issues, plus an evolutionary problem that strong emergence can't really address in a natural way. So here's one example of the space-related challenges, and you can find out more about these in the book, The Science We Need. Consider locality. So information relating to one experiential locus, for example, one point in the visual field here, is encoded at multiple brain locations. So although it's possible to write down an emergent property theory that simply states information jumps from these multiple brain locations to this one experiential location, such a theory is very unnatural on a number of grounds. So end theory, in contrast, can propose that there's this sort of matter scaffold, these blue lines, connecting brain locations and experiential locations. So information can be passed back and forth between brain loci and experiential loci in a stepwise local manner along the scaffold, again, preserving physical locality. Next, let's look at the extra dimensions that N-theory proposes, which I've mentioned in passing at the top. Just like the dark matter feature, these have a very concrete theoretical origin, again, one that's curiously neglected by mainstream accounts. So it turns out every theory in the modern scientific canon has a property called special-relativistic invariance. And this basically means that certain key natural features, such as the collisions of particles, are the same, regardless of the relative movement of different coordinate systems in which those features are described. Now, to be precise, this sameness applies to coordinate systems moving at constant velocities relative to each other. Perhaps because mainstream theories of consciousness have been typically developed by neuroscientists rather than by physicists, no one's actually examined the special relativistic invariance of theories of conscious experience. Now, although there are a couple of ways to make this invariance hold, neither of which have been adopted by the mainstream, the more theoretically natural one is to use one set of three spatial dimensions to hold matter, and another set of three, orthogonal to the first, at right angles, to hold conscious experience. So finally, and perhaps most controversially, N-theory proposes that there's something called supra-material or supra-brain intelligence or computation. Now, this reads the contents of conscious experience as a sort of input, and then places outputs in conscious experience, outputs which can then be transmitted to the matter brain via experience-to-brain coupling. Now, emphatically, this supra-brain computation feature is not just pulled randomly out of a hat, scientifically speaking. It's here to solve a problem that mainstream theories completely fail to address. What's the evolutionary benefit of conscious experience? Without a survival or thrival or reproductive benefit from conscious experience, there's no way for the detailed brain-experience relationship to have evolved by conventional Darwinian or near-Darwinian mechanisms. So this supra-brain computation hypothesis simply stands for the evolutionary benefit that experience must in some way confer, at least if any of its features have evolved. So here's N-theory in summary, and there are four main features. Conscious experience itself, for example, the colors and shapes you're seeing right now, is made from dark matter building blocks. Next, there's a two-way brain to experience and experience to brain scaffold, also made of some unconventional type of matter. Then there are extra dimensions to house conscious experience, and a supra-brain computation, finally, reading conscious experience as an input and writing output into experience, and from there into brain activity. And each of these features originates, again, in solving real scientific problems that no other single proposal addresses in full, as far as I know. But the real point of theorizing in my book is to find the killer experiment. So we do this by finding theoretically viable but distinct classes that can then be arbitrated between by currently feasible experiments. So I'm not arguing for N-theory's unique correctness based on all these theoretical points, because there's often many ways to solve them. Although again, any viable theory must address them all, and no other theory does so right now, to my knowledge. Anyway, in the big picture, N-theory stands in a specific place in a call for an experimental science. So first, we have to find out if reality is dynamically orthodox, as mainstream theories propose, or unorthodox. And there is an experiment to do this, what I call the one experiment, essentially comparing actual brain activity of a conscious subject with an orthodox physics computer simulation of the activity of that same brain. So if this experiment rules in dynamical unorthodoxy, as it will, we're still left with competing theories, as I've explained. So for example, to arbitrate between strong emergence with downward causation and an N-theoretic hypothesis, we can look at gravimetric tests. That is, sensitive measures of the gravitational field. So N-theory predicts that these measures should differ from conventional expectations for two reasons. First, the mass energy of dark matter particles associated with experience. And second, extra dimensionality close to or within conscious systems turns out to change gravitational field behavior. But finally, there's an additional differentiating signature from N-theory due to the fact that N-theoretic dynamics are not just unorthodox, that is coupled to conscious experience, but remember, experience itself is also coupled to this suprabrain computation. So there's an extra characteristic structured deviation from orthodox physics predictions that is in principle observable. So I began with what might seem like a controversial and speculative N-theoretic hypothesis, but I've shown that the definitive features of this hypothesis all originate in real and unsolved scientific problems. And further, that all these features are experimentally testable. Now, mainstream consciousness scientists will call hypotheses like N-theory unscientific or unnecessary. But in fact, it's the other way around. And N-theory is asking a very simple question to the mainstream field. When is a real science of consciousness going to begin? Here's what a real science must do. It must establish a basic methodology. It must create hypotheses that address basic physical and biological issues. And then it must declare and implement an experimental tree arbitrating between basically viable hypotheses. Now, whatever its ultimate truth or falsity status, if N-theory manages to provoke an outbreak of a real science in the midst of all the delusory smoke and mirrors that passes for current consciousness science, it will have served its basic purpose. So if you've enjoyed this presentation on N-theory, you can find a lot more related material at cfdis.org, specifically this book chapter devoted to N-theory. These other two presentations that complete what I call the sciencey trinity of 20-minute presentations on true consciousness science, the one experiment, and N-theory. And then this longer presentation, which includes a discussion of N-theory's significance for the philosophical, spiritual, and transformational directions that I hinted at earlier on today. I'm Nicholas. Thank you so much for your attention. Hope to see you again soon.